I'm going to try first to see how it looks with this light completely centered above her. And we'll see what we end up with here. So I've got it slightly above. I don't have the center of the box aiming directly at her because that's kind of the more harsh light from this softbox is directly in the center. So I try to have the center either basically feathered above her or facing down, but I try not to have that center of the softbox ever hitting the person because it just makes them look really bright. So here we go. We'll take that first test shot. And again, I just saw the image in the electronic viewfinder. Someone on social media had asked me about whether or not what I see in the viewfinder is what I see on the back of the screen, and the answer is yes. What I see on this back screen is basically the same thing I see in the electronic viewfinder. So that's where it's kind of like a powerful thing. So this is another thing as well. So I take this photo and I look at it and I say it's got that warm look to it because I'm shooting in auto white balance. So the very first thing that I like to do while I'm in the software is to change it from auto to daylight. The daylight in this case is going to give it this like kind of cooler tone. And it could very well be that this is the look that I really want to go for because their skin tone to my eyes look more natural here than it does straight out of camera here. Now this is all stuff that I'm able to check because I'm shooting tethered. If I'm not shooting tethered, I have to take 2 shots and then evaluate it on the back of the screen, and it's not the ideal situation. So looking at this particular shot, the other thing that I look at is how the shadows are impacting this particular shot. So based on where I have the light positioned, it's going to cast shadows in different parts of the face and the body and everything else. So in this case, the shadows are basically, because it's centered above her, it's falling right under the nose and it's very soft. If you notice, you could barely see the shadow compared to the highlights. Same thing, you have it under the lip, you have a little tiny bit of a shadow there, and then of course you have the shadow under the chin. So you have it under the collarbone as well. So basically, because it's above, you get this really nice, even light in the sockets of her eyes and her nose. Now, if you used a beauty dish, and this is always the question people will ask, okay, so that's what it looks like with an octa, what does it look like with an umbrella? You'll get a similar look, except the shadows will be darker. You'll have like really black, dark shadows, which may or may not look good. So in this particular case, you have really nice soft shadows, which I really like, beautiful highlights on the hair. We have good even coverage on the background as well. So this is another thing where if you want to impact the light on the background, but you want the light on her to be the same, you can actually just keep that same ratio of distance from this light to her and just pull her away from the backdrop and it gets darker. So we're going to do that. I'm actually going to have you take like 2 steps forward, 2 like military steps. There you go, just like that. So we keep everything the same. It's about the same distance away from her, except now she's farther from the background. So this is how I do my lighting. Like I'll take the first shot and I'll look at it and I actually like this lighting, but I'm going to pretend like I don't like it. Because maybe somebody out there is watching and they're like, oh, the background's too bright. Cool, no problem. Pull her off from the background. We will square this up the same way. And I'm not trying to go for composition or anything like that. I'm not trying to coach her at this point. I'm just trying to figure out how do I want the lighting, how do I want it to look. This little corner, by the way, that you see here, there's a program called Photoshoot and an alien skin exposure that cleans this up really, really nice. A lot of times I'll take these shots and the subject will look at the photo and be like, oh, that's weird, you can see the corner. This is a horrible photo. I'm like, don't worry about it. When it's done, it's not gonna have that. But here you could tell, compared to the last shot, the color looks pretty different. Like you go from like a light blue to like this really dark blue, and it could very well be that that's the look that we're trying to go for, is that darker blue. I don't know about you guys, maybe something in between might look kind of cool. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna have you take that 1 step back. I'll keep the light same relative distance here, and we'll go ahead and we will start to shoot. And any questions that you have in my hunt here to get an amazing shot, feel free to ask. Very nice. And so again, I'm using the focus and recompose method. I'm not using eye autofocus because again, you might be using a camera that doesn't have that. And I don't want you to feel like, oh, well, Miguel's using eye autofocus, so I can't get this shot. Just using focus recompose. I have the focus area on the eye. And every single shot, I'm basically putting that box on the eye, focusing halfway, and then taking the image. And I pretty much know, without really having to check, I'm fairly certain that every single one of the shots is in focus, just because I've done this for a little bit. I kind of know what my gear does, and you get very comfortable with your gear over time, and you know what it's capable of doing. So we have a few shots. We'll wait for a second here. These are 42 megapixel images that are feeding through this USB, so it takes a little bit. So while we're waiting for that, get a question.
Yeah, while we're waiting for those, a couple questions came in. One was from B. Dessler, who said, since that continuous light is not actually being used for exposure, what are you using that for, that modeling
The continuous
aspect?
light, the modeling light?
The modeling light.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the advantages actually of shooting with a studio strobe is the fact that you have this modeling light. So what it allows you to do is it helps you to focus. So whenever you actually take the photograph, that modeling light doesn't impact the exposure. It just kind of turns off and then comes back on. So all that's helping me to do is to focus. So if you had speed lights, this is a very common question. People will say, well, Miguel, I don't have a strobe, but I have a speed light. Could I use that? You could get a similar look if you had a speed light inside of this Octa. Depending on your settings, it could look very similar. The only problem is you don't have the modeling light. And without that, if we were in a dark room, it might be very difficult to get it in focus. So the modeling light's really awesome. This Odin 2 actually allows me to be able to, which I guess I should twist this around to show you guys, but with the Odin 2 transmitter, I can actually make it brighter or darker from the remote control, which is kind of handy. So typically, I'll leave it on. It does have like a sleep feature, so if you don't do anything to your camera for a little while, the modeling light turns off, and if it ever does, you could basically just push the button on the trigger and power it back on if you need to. So, good question. Any other questions on the web?
Could you let Ngrino know how far is the model from the light and that background again, if you were to estimate that?
So, if I had to estimate, I would say she's probably about 2 feet away from the light, and she is probably about 2 feet away from the background. So this is a recipe that it's just like baking a cake, right? I can give you the recipe and tell you, put the light 2 feet away and then have the backdrop 2 feet away from the model. And you could try that and be like, ew, I don't like the way that looks. So it's cool. Some people like more, sugar in their cake. That's cool. So in this type of scenario, if you want the background to be darker, pull them away from the background, keep the light at the same relative distance, and you'll have the same exposure on your subject, and then the background goes darker. If you want it to be brighter, you can have her, and actually let's do that. Be real careful, take a step back, back, a little more. So at this point, she is maybe like a foot away from the background, and if I bring this in really close, we'll take a look and we'll see how that looks. We'll get a completely different look, just kind of playing musical lights. So we'll do this one. It's beautiful, very nice. And so all the settings, everything's the same. I haven't played with the light power or anything like that. And we basically went from that dark background to a little bit of a brighter background just by playing with that positioning. So if you wanted to kind of play with that even more, you can add a second light that's just lighting just the background, and that way you can dial that up or down if you wanted to keep, from having to move the lights backwards and forwards and all that good stuff. You have options to be able to do that. So if you could, let me get the Photix reflector, and this might be a good time. I'll explain one of my favorite little modifiers. This is the Photix Tri Reflector, and this thing is pretty awesome because there's oftentimes, especially when you're just starting out in portraiture, you don't have either the gear to hold this or you don't have an assistant to be able to hold this. And so what I really like about this is that I can actually hold this reflector myself while I'm shooting. And this basically will help to soften the shadows that we're getting underneath the nose and the chin. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll take the first shot to take a look and see what that looks like. And maybe I need the silver, maybe I just need a white fill from the reflector. But it's pretty cool because I can do one of these numbers, which again, try this with a DSLR and tell me how your shoulders feel the next day. It is not fun. So I can do one of these numbers. Hold that right there, very nice. Excellent. And then I'll do one of these. Excellent. All right, so I can actually hold the camera with one hand, hold the reflector by myself. So again, you don't have to have like a big production and a bunch of gear and all this kind of stuff. This thing also folds away pretty easy. See, my folding game is on today. We had a contest yesterday with Kenna, and I couldn't fold this thing to save my life. But today I'm on point. So we'll zoom into this, and one of the things that I really like about using the reflector is not only does it give you that fill where it kind of fills in the shadows and they're not as harsh, you get this beautiful catch light in the eye. Oftentimes when I shoot portraits, I'm more concerned with the catch lights and what it's doing to the image than I am sometimes other miscellaneous things in the shot. So for me, I love the look of having the catch light from the modifier and then having the little catch light from the reflector below. But you'll notice that the shadow is a little bit softer under the neckline, all the areas where it would fall because it's completely centered. So you get a really, really beautiful look. And again, all of this just hand holding your reflector without an assistant.